famous traveller and one of the first women magistrates, as well as the owner of an exceptionally beautiful piece of England. But fate had two shocks to deliver. In 1930, at the age of 47, Edith Pretty found herself pregnant, and in due course was delivered of a son, Robert. 4 years later, her husband died, and she and her young son were left alone in the 15-bedroom house. In what must have seemed long days over the next few years, Mrs. Pretty suffered from ill health and withdrew from many of her public commitments. She sought consolation in the counsel of a spiritualist medium, making regular trips to London for guidance from her mentor. Whether she hoped to make contact with her husband cannot be said, but like many another before her, she may have found some relief and reason during the perplexity of bereavement, in the feeling that the world of the dead was an accessible and sympathetic one. It is not unlikely that these circumstances had some influence on her decision to begin investigation of the burial mounds. Visible from the large south-facing bay window, the impetus, according to some accounts, was provided by friends and relatives, among them a nephew, a dowser, who insisted that gold was to be found, while others speak of shadowy figures around the mounds after dusk, and a vision of a man on a white horse. But whatever her sensitivity to the attentions of solicitous phantoms, Mrs. Pretty was no stranger to scientific archaeology. Even as a child, she was well travelled and had seen the pyramids in Egypt. When her family were the tenants at Vale Royal in Cheshire, her father was given permission to excavate and expose the plan of the Cistercian monastery which adjoined their house. She would have been aware of the responsibilities of excavating burial mounds, and had already refused to allow enthusiastic amateurs to try their hand. In her case, a keen eye and an educated curiosity would have encouraged investigation as surely as any interest in the other world. Moreover, she required no permission from elsewhere, and in this she was following a 400-year-old precedent, the prerogative of post-Reformation landowners to investigate and upturn with shovel, spade, pit, and trench the mounds that had survived on their land. In her need for an archaeologist, Mrs. Pretty contacted Ipswich Museum, whose curator, Guy Maynard, recommended in turn a local man who had acquired the reputation of having something of a nose for an antiquity. So we meet Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist and amateur astronomer, whose knowledge of the past was broad, varied and eclectic. And here he is, with his bike. He had visited and investigated monuments in East Anglia over many years. Not being himself a landowner, some of his field work called for ingenuity rainstorm in the middle of the night to tend the Sutton Hoo excavation. I think he would have slept there if he'd had his bed. Alerted by Maynard, Basil Brown armed himself with appropriate literature on the Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman and Anglo-Saxon periods, and some suitable excavation reports. Mrs. Pretty gave him 30 shillings a week, accommodation in an upper room of the chauffeur's cottage, and the help of 2 labourers from the Sutton Hoo estate, Bert Fuller and Tom Sawyer. She instructed him to put all the excavated soil by the side of any trenches made in the mounds, ready for refilling, so that they could be returned eventually to their original appearance. The work began at Mrs. Pretty's instigation on the largest of the burial mounds, that known to us as Mound 1. On the 20th of June 1938, Mrs. Pretty produced a long probing iron of her own design and invited Basil Brown to drive it into the mound until he hit something solid. This he did. An excavation followed to a depth of 6 foot, whereupon the something solid was determined to be a stone of no particular significance. At Basil Brown's suggestion, the next day the team left Mound 1 for the time being. And proceeded to try their hands on a smaller mound, the adjacent Mound 3. Here Brown was better able to demonstrate his technique of chamber finding, a method as effective as it was traditional. Burial mounds are in general made of earth and stones, heaped over the ground surface. The burial itself is put into a hole, the chamber, which is backfilled with the subsoil that came out of it. In places where the ground surface and the subsoil are a different colour, as on sandy sites, the backfilled burial chamber is easily distinguished. An excavator, knowing this, simply has to drive a trench horizontally through the mound at about the level of the old ground surface. The backfilled chamber will soon appear as a square or rectangle of different coloured soil at the bottom of the excavation trench. Even when the trench is mucky with the continual coming and going of the excavators, the pit containing the burial should still show up. If, however, it has already been visited by a previous expedition, the contrast between the old ground surface and the refilled burial pit is often much less clear, and the pit, in consequence, harder to find. Excavators refer to an unrecorded trench cut by an earlier expedition as a robber trench, on the assumption that its primary purpose was to capture the grave goods. Spoil from the excavation trench can be piled up beside it, as in Mrs. Pretty's injunction, or it can be removed down the trench and tipped in a fan beyond it. If the mound is too tall and the makeup too soft, the sides of the excavator's trench will collapse. A safer procedure, therefore, is to cut back the edges to form terraces along their length and to barrow the spoil out along the trench. The trench in this case serves as the main thoroughfare for the excavators and the inspecting antiquaries. Finding the level of the old ground surface can be assisted by digging a pilot trench in the side of the mound, and Brown began in this way, digging a pilot trench on the east side of Mound 3. Then, using the traditional technique, he found the buried soil and the supposed burial pit. A On Saturday the 2nd of July, the excavations was nominally finished, but as late as the 19th of July, Brown was cutting another trench to the central pit to suit Mr. Reed Moir, which proved the eastern limit of the grave to everyone's satisfaction. This first excavation was hardly auspicious, but the 6th of July found Brown clearing bracken from Mound 2. He dug a test pit on the south side, throwing back into it a defunct metal bucket, laid out his trench on a compass bearing approximately east-west, following the orientation of the wooden tray just found under Mound 3. Almost immediately he discovered some pieces of iron, and with an act of recognition that was to be fundamental for the exploration of Sutton Hoo, decided that one of them was the remnant of a ship rivet. I think that might be a picture of one there. Yeah, it is. Okay. These resembled bolts a few inches long, originally with a domed head on one end and a squarish plate on the other, and were used to secure the strakes of early medieval ships. More rivets were to come, and by 14th of July the edge of a burial pit was clear to Brown, although Maynard had noted a previous robber pit. Mound 2 was big, and the sides of Brown's excavation collapsed no fewer than 3 times. On the 20th, 22nd and 28th of July. In between the cutting back and carrying away of the collapsed mound, Brown looked for and found a boat to go with his rivets. The base of the burial pit was boat-shaped without any question, and some of the rivets were still in situ. The scraps of finds included a beautiful piece of blue glass, a gilt bronze disc, iron knives, and the tip of a sword blade. Undaunted by his encounter with another robbed burial, on the 30th of July, Brown cleared the bracken from Mound 4, dug a test pit on the east side, and drove a trench westward into the mound. This mound too had been robbed, and the grave pit was very shallow. Nevertheless, the cremated bones of humans and animals were found, with fragments of bronze and textile. Brown was able to make the important interpretation that the burial rite consisted of cremated bone, wrapped in cloth and placed in a bronze bowl. So ended the 1938 season. 3 mounds had been trenched, and each had turned out to have the subject of previous explorations. The fragments of objects that had been found suggested something of the former riches of the graves, and gave an indication of their date. The imports from Mound 3 were early medieval, while the ornament on the disc from Mound 2 was Anglo-Saxon. Probably all the mounds were Anglo-Saxon, and one at least had contained a boat. In his diary and notebook, Brown never seems to express much surprise, but he could be forgiven if he had. He may have expected the Sutton Hoo mounds to be of Bronze Age date, like so many others in the vicinity, as on Martlesham Heath, if not Viking as Maynard had expected. Being Anglo-Saxon certainly made them special, but their condition was hardly encouraging. The trenches through the 3 mounds were backfilled assistant. When work restarted on the 8th of May 1939, there was no hesitation. Basil Brown was accompanied by Mrs. Pretty to the mounds, and a brief conversation ensued. I asked which one she would like opened, wrote Brown in his diary, and she pointed to one, Mound 1, the largest barrow of the group, and said, "What about this?" And I replied that it would be quite all right for me. The helpers this year were to be John Jacobs, the gardener at Little Sutton Hoo. And William Spooner, Mrs. Pretty's gamekeeper. Although Jacobs was busy in the garden till the following day, Brown made a survey, and then his trench, 4 foot wide and laid out east-west, was driven into the mound from the west. One can imagine the scene: Brown with his battered trilby and his moist and bubbling pipe, Jacobs and Spooner with spades and shovels ready to cut the turf and load a wooden wheelbarrow, of a kind more normally used to transport weeds and dead heads from the flower beds. Perhaps the job was viewed as little more than nice rest from the routine of gardening, but a change of mood was not long in coming. About midday on the Thursday, the 11th of May, Jacobs called out, "Here's a bit of iron," and held up a ship rivet. Brown immediately stopped the clearing operation. Carefully exploring the area with a small trowel, he uncovered 5 more rivets in position on what turned out to be the wooden prow or stern of a ship. It was then that inspiration took the helm. Brown reasoned that the rivets he had just found should represent the line of a vanished wooden hull. If so, he would have to dig up and over the rivets and descend on them from above, leaving each one in position. He would then be inside the ship, and by locating the plate of each rivet, he would be able to define the inside of the hull, instead of trying to follow the vanished surface of the buried soil. Brown's trench now dipped down into the hollow of a buried ship, but the 19th of May he had learned how to define the rivets in position. A pink patch in the yellow sand gave warning of the presence of a rivet, and a light brushing would reveal the red knob of corroded iron. Surrounded by crusty sand, rivet after rivet was revealed in this way at intervals of 6 to 9 inches, until so confident was Brown of predicting their positions that he could afford to leave a protective coat of sand over the rivets while tracing the inner surface of the hull. As the lines of the vessel descended deep into the ground, so did Brown's trench, always cutting into the face of the mound, until the inevitable occurred. On the 30th of May, the trench collapsed, but Brown, veteran of so many collapsed trenches, was free within a few minutes. Amongst the tonnage of fallen earth were sherds of 16th century pottery, which had obviously been introduced into the mound at a later date, probably by grave robbers. Maynard, on a visit, observed the shadow of a previous trench in the face of Brown's cutting. Brown himself described the intrusion as a pit with a treasure-seeker's hearth at the bottom. He left a standing sample of its fill of black sand and red ash in the form of a tall column that Jacobs christened the lighthouse. As Brown phlegmatically cleared up the mess and cut back his giant trench in an effort to make it safer,